Hello, it's Jacob again, and we're going to finish this up in this video by talking briefly about subsidies. So, if taxes reduce quantity traded and in doing so cause a deadweight loss, what would a subsidy do? Well, a subsidy is the reverse of a tax. Instead of charging a fee, the government instead makes a payment. Instead of requiring you to pay us for something, we're going to pay you to buy it. We're going to pay you to do it. And you might not think about these very often. They're just not as obvious in day-to-day life, but they're actually extremely common. You often see it with welfare programs. Usually when people say welfare, they specifically mean unemployment insurance, but there's other types of welfare too. Food stamps, low-income housing subsidies, subsidies for private schools, subsidies on food, which you don't necessarily see, but the government will pay farmers money to produce more food, and that keeps the price of food lower for the consumer. Subsidies to healthcare, subsidies to education. Government gives people cheap student loans. There's all kinds of welfare types of subsidies. And then you've got the corporate welfare subsidies. The government gives a lot of money to private industries in order to encourage them to produce more. Often this is justified. There's really two main groups that they do this with. Farmers tend to get subsidies because it's easy. You know, most farming is done by big corporate farms now. Bill Gates is one of the largest farmers in the country, but it's easy to sell it at election time as being, subsidies to mom and pop's farm. And this comes up a lot with protectionism. People that want to promote American industry, made in America. And so they'll subsidize our uncompetitive industries in order to make them competitive. China can make an endless sea of cheap garbage. American companies cannot compete with that on price. So the government just puts part of the bill so that they can sell it for cheap enough. But as we'll see, subsidies also bear a cost. Subsidies are considered a policy failure, and for a good reason. Now, we're going to move through this quickly because all of the logic is the same. It's just reversed. So, for the consumer or producer, a subsidy is going to be a good thing. You're getting paid instead of having to pay. So, if a consumer has a certain level of marginal benefits before the subsidy, then after the subsidy, they're going to get more. They get whatever benefits they had before, plus the subsidy. Now, when benefits rise, that triggers a positive demand shock, right? Which raises the quantity traded and raises the sticker price. Why does that sticker price go up? Well, consumers want the product more now. They want it more because they're going to get the subsidy, so they're going to bid the price up. What if we give the subsidy to a producer? Well, a producer has a certain marginal cost of production, but after the subsidy, that's basically, I'm sorry, this video has been so sloppy. I actually completely redid my presentation for this summer course. I was making big improvements to how I teach it. After the subsidy, they're going to get the same marginal, they're going to have the same marginal costs minus the subsidy. It's cheaper for them to make the good because they're getting a little bit of pay to do it. And what happens when their cost falls? Well, they have a positive supply shock, quantity traded rises, and the sticker price falls. So far, everything's the reverse of a tax, right? A tax is a bad thing for the person that has to pay it, so you get negative shocks and the quantity falls. A subsidy is a good thing for the person that gets it, so they have positive shocks and the quantity traded rises. Now, also like the tax, this is going to mean that marginal benefits do not equal marginal costs at the new equilibrium. So you see here, if we give that subsidy to the consumer, so they're getting marginal benefits plus the subsidy equal to marginal costs at their new equilibrium, we can rearrange that to get this equation. If we give it to the producer, marginal cost minus subsidy have to be equal to the marginal benefits. We'll get the same equation. Both of these can be rearranged to yield the same equation. The gap between the marginal cost and the marginal benefit has to be equal in size to the subsidy. Now remember, when I showed this to you for taxes, demand is higher than supply when we're talking about quantities below equilibrium. Well, after you move beyond that equilibrium, it flips, right? If the quantity is going to be above the equilibrium, then the costs, the marginal cost, the supply is going to be higher than the marginal benefits, the demand. And so the gap begins to widen. As you increase quantity from 0, it falls until you get to equilibrium where it's 0, and then it starts to increase. It widens. And since it's constantly widening, there's only going to be one gap equal in size to the subsidy. So just like with the tax, who we give the subsidy to isn't going to matter, because the consumer price and the producer price are going to be the same either way. Now, everything else we've said about taxes applies here, except the consumer price is now lower than the producer price because the consumer isn't paying the whole bill. Part of the subsidy will get passed along, although in this case, you're happy to get it passed to you. You want more of it to get passed to you. The more elastic both curves are, the more the quantity rises. And the more relatively inelastic one party is, the more of the subsidy that's going to get passed to them. So all of our reasoning stays the same. So what's the problem? Based on what I've described so far, you might not see one. With the price controls, ceiling and floor, and with the tax, the problem was always that the quantity fell. We could see that there were unrealized gains from trade. If only the consumer could offer the producer a better price and vice versa, then they would be able to trade some more, move resources from low value to high value uses. What would be the problem with having too much? Can you have such a thing as too much? Well, yes. I got a little ahead of myself. This is very good to study, just like the tax one is, for your exam. I mean, your exam is more like a giant homework assignment, but still. The problem is the consumer and producers party is being held on government money. So whereas the tax was being taken from the gains from trade, the tax was still a gain. It was still wealth that was being produced. The subsidy, by contrast, is being paid for by someone else, which means it's not free. We don't consider the subsidy to be a positive here. On the contrary, you have taken from other people because they would have benefited from having that money, and now they don't have it. And what you find is that the gains the consumer and producer get from the extra quantity are going to be canceled out by the taxpayer's loss. So let's go through and look at each of these. Now, on the producer side of things, they're getting this big triangle. They get B, C, D, and E after the subsidy is implemented. And from the consumer's perspective, they get that other big triangle, A, B, C, and F. Now, within this area, B and C have overlap. The consumer and the producer are both getting B, and they're both getting C. But remember, we have to subtract the subsidy expenditure because that's been taken away from someone else. And so if we have +2 and -1, that cancels out and you just get 1. So this blue area here, it's not a loss, but it's not a gain either. It's not a gain compared to before the subsidy, when society got this whole triangle. Now, what about F and E? Well, E the producer gets, and F the consumer gets. But again, they're only getting it because they're taking it from someone else. That's not new wealth, that was just redistributed. And so we cannot count that as a gain. And what does that leave us with? G. G is just the subsidy. That's just resources that were drawn away from some other place. A pure loss to the person who had to pay for it. But most importantly, their loss here is not offset by the consumer and the producer. In E, F, B, and C, the taxpayer might be suffering from having to pay the subsidy, but at least the consumer and producer's enjoyment of it, the consumer surplus and the producer surplus, offset that. With G, they don't offset that. They don't value the good as much as the taxpayer valued the money that was spent on it. What the subsidy does is it wastes resources. At that elevated level of production, the producer values the resources more than the consumer. Remember, again, their opportunity cost is the benefits of the next best alternative. And we could be talking about a worker considering more leisure time. We could be talking about a business considering using its machinery and other capital to do a different product line. We could be talking about the raw resources themselves. Whatever kind of resource it is, there was some scarce resource there that the producer valued more than the consumer. And because of that, the consumer was not able to make them an offer sufficient for them to voluntarily produce at that level. Well, now you introduce the subsidy. Now the government steps in and says, I'm going to pay you money to do it anyways. Well, if you'll pay them money, if you'll pay the producer enough money to offset their loss, yeah, they'll be willing to do it. but that doesn't make it efficient. The government could have just paid them money outright. The money that would have been spent on the subsidy could have just been a straight up check to them, and it would have actually been less destructive. Because the resources at that level are better off staying in the hands of the producer, being used for some other purpose. The subsidy is destructive, and it's only possible to goose that quantity to a higher level because the government is compensating them for the destruction with other people's money. I didn't tell you the story of why it's labeled corn subsidy. Corn is one of the biggest things that the US government subsidizes. That's the reason why corn syrup is in all your food. They make it extremely cheap, and so they make a heck of a lot of it. Well, put another way, the good, corn in these graphs, was not worth making for its own sake. And keep in mind, again, underlying this whole assumption is that resources have value, that they can be applied to other purposes. They're scarce. We have other things we could be doing with them. So you ask this philosophical question, can there be too much of a good thing? The answer is yes. Something could be good in and of itself, yet you could have too much of it if having more of it means having too little of another thing. Subsidies are going to draw resources into an industry beyond the level that is socially optimal, beyond the level that the consumer and producer value the product at. And it gets even worse. So subsidies, they're really dangerous, because they sound like such a good idea. I think most people they understand that naturally why taxes would be bad, but subsidies they initially they sound very attractive. Oh, I can have a bigger market and make things cheaper for the consumer and increase profits for the producer. This sounds like a really good deal. Well, I've explained to you why this is considered wasteful, that it results in a misallocation of resources. But there's another problem too, because the subsidy money had to come from somewhere. And where does it come from? Well, it doesn't have to be a tax. A lot of governments do operate their own industries. You'll have a government that plays producer. They'll have businesses that they run for a profit, but it's probably a tax. And what does the tax have? A deadweight loss. So the worst thing you could do as a government, tax money and then spend it on things people don't need. There will be a waste of resources from the subsidy, too much being produced, and there will be a waste of resources laying dormant from the tax. Now, as was mentioned, subsidies have the same effects from elasticity as taxes. And so the more elastic both curves are, the worse the deadweight loss is going to be, because the increased quantity is considered bad in this case. And unfortunately, this often runs directly contrary to the goals of a government using them. Sometimes subsidies are intended just to reduce the price, or again, to increase profits for the producer. But very often, increasing consumption is itself the goal. Well, microeconomic theory would say that is an inherently bad goal. And the more relatively inelastic a curve is, the greater that party's incidence will be. So again, part of the subsidy is going to get passed along. So if you're going to subsidize things, you need to ask yourself, who's going to benefit more, the consumer or the producer? Either one of those can be a legitimate goal. You might have heard people complain about how some big companies like Amazon and Walmart benefit from lower income, various welfare programs, right? The government has programs that help to assist the poor, but because they assist the poor, that means that the companies can get away with paying lower wages. That's true. Now, what people will often misunderstand about this is they'll think that it ends up making the poor even poorer, and that's not true, right? The employee, the producer in this scenario, they still have greater profits. They still have greater take-home pay at the end of the day. But it does mean that some of your money is going to Walmart's pockets, yeah. And some of your money is going to Amazon's pockets. I love Amazon as a consumer, but like their treatment of the union is heinous. I'm very disgusted with that. We don't really get into it in this course, since I don't teach you the I might end up including a little bit of labor unions material. Suffice it to say, I may be far on the free market side, but I love unions. I am fully in favor of unions. So yeah, if the government is looking to help certain kinds of people, it needs to be aware of this. So you want to find things like, for example, if you're trying to help consumers, you're going to want things that are relatively inelastically demanded. So earlier I showed you how with a tax, that would backfire horribly if you tried to tax a pharmaceutical company. But if you were going to subsidize them, you would expect most of the subsidy to get passed along to the consumer. So subsidies on things like medicine can be a very good idea. On the other hand, for things like low income housing, where again, land and housing are probably pretty inelastically supplied, not a good idea. That's probably going to backfire because most of the subsidy is probably going to get passed along to the landlord. So, why do we even use taxes and subsidies? Well, despite carrying deadweight loss, taxes and subsidies do have a role to play in markets. I don't want you to walk away from this with the assumption that this is just a course in how everything from the government is bad. One of the roles they play is in dealing with a problem called externalities, which will be our next topic. Situations where the free market by itself doesn't properly reward or punish people for the effect they have on others. And so if we were to implement a tax or subsidy, it would actually make the market more efficient. As you'll see in the next topic, this is the rationale behind things like carbon taxes or taxes on pollution. Those are considered economically good. And then there are situations like public goods, where a free market cannot serve a need by itself, at least not effectively. And we'll talk about those two topics from now, in excludability and rivalry. Now, very little of what the government does is actually true public goods in an economic sense. But there are certain things that can be considered public goods. Mostly those which conform to the ideal of what's called a night watchman state or a minarchist state. The government provides courts of law, it provides police, it provides national defense. And personally, I would argue that one of the most valuable roles that the government plays in society is actually promoting scientific research as well. And then finally, there's social engineering. You might be willing to sacrifice some wealth to shape society to your liking. Oftentimes, countries will subsidize industries that have sentimental value. If you have a country, for example, where small farmers are a big part of your identity, or maybe it's say ranches, like how in America where we at least used to be very proud of our cowboy culture. Well, maybe your society is willing to have a smaller economy if it means that it gets to protect a certain way of life. This comes up a lot with redistribution of wealth. Some people believe that a smaller economy might be preferable to a very unequal economy. We have essentially a sort of diminishing returns to income. And so an extra dollar to a rich man may not be as valuable to you as an extra dollar to a poor man. I don't care so much about the ethical side of inequality. Simply put, I don't view it as unethical, but I do care a lot about it. And we'll come to that later in the course about I care a lot about it in as much as it affects the political system. Unequal societies tend to be sick societies. They have unstable political systems. They have corrupt elites that run roughshod over the poor. And so that can be a very reasonable goal. And then there's also punishing things you don't like. Usually people don't word it that way, but that's pretty common. And taxes and subsidies can also be an excellent alternative to price controls. So, for example, there's a thing called an earned income tax credit, which is a subsidy on labor. Now, whereas a minimum wage would decrease the quantity of labor used in an industry, a subsidy would increase it. Price controls always reduce the quantity, subsidies increase the quantity. And so, if you want to help the working poor, earned income tax credits are awesome because they lower unemployment and they raise incomes at the same time. Now, the downside is that the government does have to pay for it, and that means they do have to pay for it out of taxes. But by raising the quantity, that also raises the tax base as well. I think it's a much more justifiable policy. Likewise, if the government needs to get consumption down for some reason, like say for wartime rationing, taxation can do that without causing a shortage. So, for example, very often this idea is upsetting to people because it goes up against their notion of fairness. They'll think, well, I don't like the idea of having a product where wealthier people get access to it and poor people do not. Um, but the problem is when you have a shortage, you often get these very lopsided outcomes where the first person that shows up to the store gets everything. Or, the first, say, couple dozen people that show up to the store get everything. In the end, the product's going to be rationed somehow, right? People will pay people to stand in line for them if they need to. But depending on the kind of product, you can run into problems where it's not acceptable to have shortages because it's not acceptable for some people to go without completely. So, like with food, you'd have to ask yourself, which is worse? Everyone, like all the poor being hungry, or the very poor starving? If you use taxes, that can smoothly decrease the consumption of food without causing a shortage where some people don't get any at all. So taxation can be a very rational alternative to rationing. And it doesn't have to be food, right? It could be rationing of anything. They would ration things like gasoline and metal back during the World Wars. So, in conclusion, we can summarize all of our implications with the following 10 implications of supply and demand. 1, taxing luxuries is an awful idea. It's going to backfire and you're going to put people out of work. 2, tax natural resources. They're fairly inelastic overall, at least compared to other, lines of work. They're pretty inelastic. It's mostly going to screw over the producer. And I think as a rule, we don't care about them as much as we do the consumer. So soak them for as much as you can. 3, sin taxes don't work and are cruel. They tend to be inelastically demanded, so you're going to raise a lot of money, but you're not going to discourage the behavior. It's a form of targeted extortion. 4, to tax efficiently, tax broadly. Go after whole categories of goods. Go after spending in general. Things like sales taxes work very well. Do not have a complicated tax code. 5, avoid easily evaded targets. If people can easily get around your tax by just buying something else or buying from somewhere else, it's your tax is going to be a bad tax. 6, the cost of taxes are higher than we think. When you spend tax money on a program, it's not just about the alternative uses of the money. It's also about all of the commerce that you destroyed by people working less to avoid paying the tax. 7, to help consumers, subsidize things with inelastic demand. 8, to help producers, subsidize things with inelastic supply. 9, subsidies have double costs, wasted resources, and the tax that paid for it. They're very destructive. And so they should be used very cautiously. And 10, taxes and subsidies can be better than price floors and ceilings. Even though all 4 of them are considered policy failures, if you have a certain goal, you need to move the quantity around for some reason, then you'd rather do it this way. So in conclusion, taxes and subsidies both distort markets by creating an artificial new equilibrium. Taxes reduce the quantity by reducing the potential gains from trade, the private ones, I should say, because the government is going to confiscate part of it. And subsidies increase quantity by increasing the private gains from trade, but they waste society's resources in the process. Tax and subsidy incidents are determined not by who it's on, not by who pays the tax or who gets the subsidy, but rather by the relative elasticities. The more elastic it is, the less of it gets passed to you. And the deadweight loss is going to be worse the more elastic either curve is. And as a curve becomes very inelastic, the deadweight loss will get close to 0. Now, next up, we'll be looking at the main circumstance where we want to use taxes and subsidies, externalities. So in an externality, the consumption or production of the good has an effect, positive or negative, on people not privy to the deal. And we'll see that this likewise distorts the equilibrium by making the private equilibrium price too low or too high. And what we'll see is that a government can use a special kind of subsidy or tax to correct it. If the market is bent out of place, a tax or subsidy is going to bend it back to where it should be. And this is also where we'll start to get into our treatment of environmental economics. How can we manage pollution, resource depletion, animal endangerment, etc.? Because a lot of that subject matter is going to directly tie into externalities. Well, I'll see you in the next one.